Every secret waits for its stage, and some secrets choose their moment with devastating precision. What began as an evening of laughter and elegance turned into a lesson about dignity, silence, and the power of truth when it finally speaks. You won't want to miss what happened when one woman stood up and rewrote the meaning of respect in a single breath. Support this channel by subscribing and liking, and tell me in the comments what you think about the unfolding drama and where you're watching from. Evelyn Johnson, a 62-year-old black widow, had always believed she knew every corner of her husband Richard's life, but when he passed away after a painful battle with pancreatic cancer, she discovered that even after decades of marriage, he still held secrets that would change everything. Evelyn had built her entire identity around being a proud black woman who carried herself with dignity despite the world often underestimating her. She worked hard, raised her daughter Alicia, supported Richard in his career as a history professor, and maintained a modest but respectable home in Southeast Washington, D.C. Her neighbors knew her as a woman of faith, discipline, and quiet pride. When Richard died, the loss hollowed her out, and in the empty silence of her house, she clung to every instruction he left her. Among his final whispered words was a curious directive: check the safety deposit box at First National Bank, box 311, with a key hidden in his jewelry case behind the velvet lining. She expected documents like insurance policies or family papers, but she never imagined what she would find. The day she went to the bank, Evelyn carried herself with her usual calm presence. Dressed in a navy dress Richard always admired, she walked into the marble building where the teller, recognizing her, offered condolences. Evelyn nodded politely, too weary to reply. She was led into the private viewing room where the metal box awaited her. Her hands, normally so steady, trembled as she turned the key and slid open the drawer. Inside lay a thick envelope. She sat down, opened it, and pulled out stacks of documents filled with neat handwriting and official stamps. Investment portfolios, trust documents, deeds, stock certificates, all under the name of Richard Anthony Johnson. At the very top, a summary sheet written in Richard's careful script spelled out the total value. Evelyn froze. She blinked once, twice, then leaned closer. 127,450, zero. $127,450,000. She whispered the number under her breath as if saying it aloud might make it vanish. Her heart thumped against her ribs, her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. For decades, she and Richard had lived as though they barely scraped by. They cut coupons, packed lunches, and took pride in small savings. She had stood beside him while he worked long hours, and she had taught Alicia to never be ashamed of humble beginnings. Richard never let on that behind all of that sacrifice, he was quietly building a fortune. Evelyn sat back hard in the chair, feeling both betrayed and awed. She thought of every night she had worried about bills, every time she stayed up late sewing Alicia's school clothes, every anxious moment about money, and realized Richard had been holding back something monumental. Yet Evelyn understood. Richard had known her pride better than anyone. He knew she would have rejected wealth if it meant losing her sense of self, her respect for hard work, and the dignity of her black identity. Money changed people, and Richard must have believed that Evelyn, and especially their daughter, needed to grow up without the weight of millions overshadowing them. He wanted them to know struggle, resilience, and perseverance because those lessons could never be bought. Evelyn pressed the sheet of paper to her chest, whispering, "Richard, you stubborn man. You really thought this was the way to protect us." After a long while, she put everything back in order and locked the box. She thanked the teller with a faint smile and stepped into the late afternoon sun. The city bustled around her, horns blaring, people rushing, but Evelyn felt like she was carrying an invisible world in her handbag. This was not just about money, it was a test. She would not tell Alicia yet. She would not tell anyone. She wanted to see how her daughter's fiancé and his wealthy family treated her. She wanted to see who, in this world of polished smiles and polite prejudice, could respect a black widow they believed to be ordinary. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to Alicia, who had worked hard to become a dermatologist. Alicia was beautiful, smart, ambitious, but also young and eager to fit into the circles of her fiancé David Whitmore. Evelyn had seen subtle changes in her daughter's tone during phone calls, a nervous eagerness in her voice, the kind of energy that came from wanting to impress. Evelyn decided that now, more than ever, the secret must remain hidden. She wanted to observe without bias, to let people reveal themselves. Walking back to her car, Evelyn lifted her chin high. She was a black woman who had weathered storms, carried burdens, and faced condescension her entire life. The world often measured her worth through the color of her skin and the simplicity of her means, but now she held the power to measure others. Richard had left her more than money. He had left her a mirror to hold up to the world. At home, Evelyn sat in her living room, staring at Richard's photograph. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when they had almost nothing but faith. She thought of Alicia as a little girl, sitting on Richard's knee as he told her stories about heroes who fought for freedom. She realized Richard's fortune was not meant to make them rich in material things. It was meant to challenge them to remain rich in values. Evelyn swore to herself that she would honor him, not by flaunting the wealth, but by protecting the lessons of humility and pride he had lived by. Evelyn Johnson sat alone in her living room, the evening light filtering through the blinds and casting soft golden stripes across the carpet, and her mind was still spinning from the weight of the secret she carried. A secret worth 127, 450, zero that she had discovered only weeks earlier in Richard's safety deposit box. She had promised herself she would not reveal it yet, not to Alicia, not to anyone, because she wanted to test the people around her, to see who would show her respect when they believed she was nothing more than a grieving black widow from a modest neighborhood. It was a decision she carried like armor, and though the knowledge sometimes burned inside her, she kept it close. That evening, her daughter Alicia, now a young dermatologist in her early 30s, came through the door with a brightness in her eyes that Evelyn had not seen since before Richard's passing. Alicia kissed her mother's cheek, sat down on the couch, and began talking quickly, almost nervously, her words spilling out before Evelyn had time to settle. "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet," Alicia said, her eyes shining. "His name is David Whitmore, and he's the man I want to marry." Evelyn felt her heart stop for a moment, not because she disapproved of love or feared her daughter's happiness, but because she knew the Whitmore name. A family of wealth and prestige in Washington's elite circles, a family that moved in worlds very different from their own. Evelyn composed herself, forcing a smile and nodding. "Tell me about him, baby," she said softly, her voice steady, though her mind raced. Alicia leaned forward, her hands twisting together in her lap, and she spoke with the eager excitement of a young woman deeply in love. "He's smart, Mom, really smart. He's finishing his MBA at Georgetown, and he's been working with his father at Whitmore Investments. He's kind, thoughtful, and he treats me so well. I really think he's the one." Evelyn listened carefully, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face, noticing not just the words but the way Alicia's voice trembled with both excitement and an edge of insecurity. There was a nervousness there, the kind Evelyn had seen when Alicia was a child before a big exam or during her first medical residency interview. It was the sound of someone who desperately wanted approval, not just from her mother, but from the world she was stepping into. Evelyn reached over and squeezed Alicia's hand. "Do you love him?" she asked, her voice calm and deliberate. Alicia's eyes softened, and she smiled the kind of smile that told Evelyn the answer before the words came. "More than anything," Alicia said. Evelyn nodded, feeling both relief and worry mingled together. Love was powerful, but she knew love could be tested, especially across lines of wealth, class, and race. Evelyn asked when she would meet him, and Alicia immediately suggested the coming weekend. "He wants to meet you, Mom. He wants us to have dinner here, just like we used to do when Dad was alive. He says he wants to know the woman who raised me," Alicia said, her voice filled with hope. Evelyn smiled and agreed, though deep inside she wondered if David's desire was truly about knowing her or about evaluating her, measuring the background of the woman who had raised the black daughter, now stepping into his privileged world. After Alicia left that evening, Evelyn sat in the quiet once more, staring at Richard's photograph on the mantel. She whispered to him, telling him about Alicia's news, about this man from a wealthy white family who had captured their daughter's heart. She felt the sting of worry. She thought about the times she had walked into rooms filled with people who looked at her skin before her face, who decided her worth before hearing her words. She thought about how easily society treated black families as less, no matter their education or dignity. Now her daughter was stepping into a family that wielded wealth and influence, and Evelyn could not help but wonder how they would view her. Would they see her as the proud woman she was, or as an obstacle, an embarrassment to be managed? The days leading up to the dinner felt long, filled with Evelyn's quiet contemplation. She went about her routine, cooking meals, tending to her small garden, keeping the house in order, but her mind never strayed far from the upcoming meeting. She remembered Alicia's excited face, the eagerness in her voice, and she wondered how much of that excitement was about love and how much was about status. Evelyn reminded herself of the secret she held, the 127, 450, zero that could buy and sell the very world the Whitmores lived in, and yet she remained determined not to reveal it. She wanted to see them, to hear them, to witness how they treated her when they thought she had nothing. It would be a test not just for the Whitmores but for Alicia as well. Would her daughter stand tall in her heritage, proud of her mother's sacrifices, or would she shrink into silence in order to belong? On Saturday, Evelyn prepared the house as she had for years whenever Alicia brought friends over. She polished the table, laid out the china Richard had insisted on buying when they were young, and cooked the kind of meal that filled the home with warmth and memory. She thought of Richard's laughter, of Alicia's giggles as a child, and for a moment she let herself feel normal, as though this were just another family dinner. But when the knock came at the door and Alicia walked in with David by her side, Evelyn's breath caught. David was tall, with neatly combed hair and a crisp suit that spoke of privilege. His smile was polite, his handshake firm, but Evelyn noticed his eyes flicking quickly around the living room, taking in the worn furniture, the simple curtains, the framed photographs of family milestones. Evelyn watched carefully, seeing the flicker of judgment masked by charm. "Mrs. Johnson, it's an honor to meet you," David said smoothly. Evelyn nodded, her smile polite but cautious. "Welcome, David," she replied, ushering them in. The memory clung to her as she prepared herself for the next dinner, the one Alicia had eagerly arranged so that her mother could spend more time with David in a more personal setting. And Evelyn knew that if she wanted to see the true nature of this man who had captured her daughter's heart, she would have to keep her eyes open and her words measured. She reminded herself of the vow she had made after discovering Richard's secret fortune of 127, 450, zero, that she would not reveal it to anyone until she had seen who would respect her without knowing, because the value of character could never be measured by bank accounts, only by actions and words spoken when no one suspected wealth hiding behind plain walls. On Saturday evening, Alicia arrived with David once again, this time carrying a bouquet of flowers and a practiced smile, his tailored suit fitting him as neatly as the polished phrases he used when greeting Evelyn. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for having me again. It's truly wonderful to be here," he said, his voice even, his expression pleasant, but Evelyn noticed how his eyes flicked around the room once more, cataloging the simple furniture, the faded but clean curtains, the photographs of birthdays and graduations that lined the shelves, and she felt the same subtle sting she had felt the first time. She ushered them inside, offering warm but cautious hospitality, and Alicia beamed, eager to show her mother and her fiancé in harmony. They sat at the dinner table, Evelyn serving Richard's favorite roast chicken recipe, and the conversation turned toward work, family, and plans for the future. David spoke proudly of his studies at Georgetown and his involvement with his father's investment firm, describing the way they managed portfolios for high-net-worth clients, and though his words were smooth, Evelyn caught the faint undercurrent of arrogance, the kind that suggested he was used to rooms filled with men who nodded at his every statement. When Evelyn mentioned her own career in hospital facilities management, David leaned back with a smile and said, "It must take incredible strength to keep everything running in such an environment. You really are a strong black woman." And though the words on the surface seemed complimentary, the tone he used felt rehearsed, like he was repeating a line he had learned to say in order to appear enlightened. Evelyn smiled politely but felt her jaw tighten, her years of experience telling her when words carried condescension behind their polish. Alicia laughed nervously, eager to keep the mood light, and quickly shifted the conversation to the wedding plans. She spoke about dates, venues, and guest lists, her eyes flicking between her mother and David, as though she were trying to balance their worlds. Evelyn listened quietly, noting the way Alicia's voice carried both excitement and anxiety, and she thought again of Richard, of how he would have encouraged their daughter to stand firm in who she was rather than bending to fit into someone else's frame. After dinner, when Alicia cleared the plates, Evelyn and David found themselves alone for a few minutes, and David leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know how much I love Alicia. She means the world to me, and I want to take care of her. I know our families come from different backgrounds, but I truly believe love can bridge any gap." Evelyn studied him carefully, hearing the sincerity in his words, but also hearing the subtle implication that Alicia was stepping up into his world rather than meeting him on equal ground. She nodded slowly, offering a small smile. "Love does bridge gaps, David," she said, "but respect keeps them closed." The evening ended with polite goodbyes, but Evelyn's heart was heavy. She saw the way David carried himself, confident and charming, but she also saw the quick glances, the unconscious judgments, and the way Alicia seemed to shrink slightly when conversations turned to matters of class or wealth. Later that night, as she cleaned the dishes alone, Evelyn thought again of the secret she held. She could have silenced every ounce of condescension by laying a single bank statement on the table, by revealing that she, a black widow from Southeast DC, controlled more wealth than David's entire family likely imagined. But she did not. She would not. She needed to know who they were without the influence of money. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself replaying not only David's words, but also Alicia's silences. Her daughter, once so proud of her upbringing, seemed increasingly hesitant to speak against comments that carried undertones of class and race, and Evelyn's heart ached. She wanted to shake Alicia, to remind her of the lessons Richard had drilled into her, that dignity, pride, and character were not negotiable, that no amount of wealth or influence could ever outweigh self-respect. But Evelyn held her tongue. She knew there would be more moments ahead, more opportunities to see how deep David's affection ran and how much Alicia was willing to compromise. For now, she kept her secret and her patience, determined to watch, to listen, and to learn. Evelyn had made a decision long ago, after discovering the hidden fortune of 127,450, zero left by Richard, that she would not reveal her wealth until she was certain of people's hearts, and she carried that secret into the evening of the Whitmore dinner like an invisible shield. She wanted to see who they were when they believed she had nothing, and more importantly, she wanted to see how Alicia would carry herself in the company of those who came from such a different world. When Saturday evening came, Evelyn dressed with deliberate care. She wore a deep burgundy dress Richard had once told her brought out the strength in her eyes, and she wrapped herself in a shawl her mother had left her, a reminder of her roots. She drove across the city, each mile carrying her further from her familiar Southeast neighborhood and into the manicured lawns and gated driveways of Maryland's elite. When she pulled up to the Whitmore estate, her breath caught. The house was more like a museum than a home, a grand colonial mansion with white columns, circular driveway, and gardens that looked sculpted by artists rather than tended by gardeners. Evelyn parked where she was instructed, clutching her handbag tightly as she walked up the steps. The massive wooden door opened, and Alicia greeted her with an anxious smile, her hands fluttering like a nervous child's. "Mom, you look beautiful," Alicia said, hugging her quickly before stepping aside to let her in. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive wine, the walls lined with paintings Evelyn suspected cost more than her entire house. David appeared at her side, his hand at the small of Alicia's back, his voice cheerful as he introduced his parents. "Mom, Dad, this is Mrs. Evelyn Johnson." Edward Whitmore stepped forward first, tall and broad-shouldered, his handshake firm but calculated, his eyes scanning her face as though weighing her worth in an instant. "Samuel tells me you work at the hospital," he said smoothly, using her late husband's name as though it were a detail in a file. "Must be satisfying work, keeping the lights on and the systems running." His words, polite on the surface, carried the same underlying tone Evelyn had heard from David, condescension wrapped in courtesy. Evelyn smiled evenly. "It has its rewards," she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. Margaret Whitmore followed, elegant in a gown that seemed too formal for a simple family dinner, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier. She took Evelyn's hand lightly, her smile practiced. "We're so excited about the wedding," she said in a tone of rehearsed warmth. "Victoria has such diverse taste in people, it's one of her most admirable qualities." Evelyn stiffened, catching the phrasing, though Alicia either did not notice or pretended not to. Diverse taste in people. As though her daughter were a prize for choosing someone outside the expected mold, as though being black was not an identity but an accessory. Evelyn's heart clenched, but she kept her composure. She had endured such subtle prejudice before, and she knew the strength of silence. Dinner was served by uniformed staff who moved in and out of the room like shadows, and Evelyn took her seat at the long polished table, feeling like she had been placed in a theater rather than a home. Conversation flowed around her, led mostly by Edward, who spoke of markets and clients and high-level connections, name-dropping senators and executives as though they were old friends. Margaret interjected with stories of charity galas she had hosted, speaking of giving back to the community while glancing past the staff who poured her wine, never once acknowledging their presence. Evelyn observed everything carefully, listening, storing every detail, her face calm but her mind sharp. She noticed Alicia too, the way her daughter sat straighter, quieter, her voice deferential when she spoke, as though she were afraid to appear too bold. The daughter who had once proudly declared she would carry her family's name into the world now seemed to shrink under the weight of the Whitmore table, and Evelyn's heart ached. At one point, Edward asked Alicia about her residency. Evelyn expected her daughter to beam with pride, to share her accomplishments, but instead Alicia downplayed her successes, brushing off compliments with nervous laughter, as though not to appear boastful in front of people who measured worth in wealth rather than work. Evelyn wanted to interrupt, to remind her daughter to stand tall, but she held her tongue, determined to see the evening through. Later, when Margaret brought up the wedding budget, Alicia quickly offered to contribute more than Evelyn knew she could afford, and Margaret laughed, patting her hand as one would pat a child's. "Don't be silly, darling. Charles and I are happy to handle the wedding expenses. We understand the financial differences between our families." The way she said financial differences made Evelyn's skin prickle, as though she and Alicia were charity cases being sponsored rather than equals being welcomed. Evelyn held her fork tightly, forcing her face into polite neutrality, but inside her blood boiled. She thought of the fortune Richard had left her, 127, 450, zero sitting quietly in accounts that could buy and sell every piece of silver on this table, and yet here she was being treated like an outsider, someone beneath consideration. She wanted to stand up, to slam the papers on the table and watch their smug smiles falter, but she remembered her promise to Richard, and she remained silent. This was the test, and she was determined to see it through. As dessert was served, Margaret leaned across the table, her smile wide but her eyes sharp. "Now, Evelyn, we'll need a list of your family and friends for the invitations. The venue can hold 300 guests." Evelyn raised her eyebrows slightly, thinking of her small circle. "I don't need many invitations," she said honestly. "Most of my family is gone, and I have perhaps 20 close friends." Margaret's smile grew tighter, her eyes flickering to Edward. "Of course, sometimes smaller families are cozier," she said, her tone condescending though cloaked in sweetness. Edward cleared his throat and added, "We should probably discuss seating as well. We'll have some very important business associates attending, senators, judges, CEOs. We want to make sure everyone feels comfortable." Evelyn heard the unspoken message clearly. Her friends, her people, would not be seated among the elite. Evelyn Johnson drove home from the Whitmore estate that night, with her hands clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that her knuckles ached, the mansion's glittering lights shrinking behind her as if mocking the quiet dignity of her modest Southeast DC. Home, and though she forced herself to breathe evenly, her chest still carried the weight of Margaret's patronizing smile and Edward's casual arrogance, both of them dismissing her life's work and her family's history with the polished cruelty of people who had never had to question their own worth. She had endured condescension her entire life, from store clerks who assumed she could not afford certain items to colleagues who acted as if her role in hospital management was menial labor, but tonight's dinner struck deeper because her daughter Alicia had sat silently beside them, bowing her head, shrinking herself, and accepting the narrative that the Whitmores were the generous benefactors and she, Evelyn, was the grateful outsider. That silence cut Evelyn far more than the words themselves, for it was a silence that betrayed the lessons Richard had spent years teaching their daughter about dignity, pride, and self-respect. Evelyn parked in front of her house and sat for a long moment, staring at the photograph of Richard on her dashboard, whispering into the dark, "You would have never let them get away with that. And you would never have let Alicia think it was acceptable." The days that followed only reinforced Evelyn's unease. The wedding planning accelerated, driven largely by Margaret, who made every decision sound like a magnanimous favor. Venues, florists, Photographers, all handpicked by the Whitmore's network of expensive contacts, were presented to Alicia as if generosity rather than control were being extended. Evelyn watched her daughter nod along, thanking them profusely, promising she and David would cover what they could even though Evelyn knew the math did not add up. And each time Alicia volunteered her own resources, Evelyn saw Margaret's eyes light up with satisfaction, as though extracting concessions were part of the game. Evelyn bit her tongue, remembering her promise to Richard to hold back the truth of the 127, 450, 0 until the right moment, but each passing slight tested her patience. One evening, Alicia invited her mother to join a cake tasting in Georgetown. Evelyn agreed, thinking it would be a simple mother-daughter outing. But when she arrived, she found Margaret already there, draped in a pearl necklace and sipping champagne as if she were chairing a board meeting rather than choosing dessert. The baker presented tiers of frosted masterpieces, each one more expensive than the last, and Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Of course, we must keep costs reasonable," she said with a smile that made Evelyn's stomach twist. "Not everyone can afford the luxury tier." The words hung in the air like a blade, and Alicia laughed nervously, casting a quick glance at her mother, but saying nothing. Evelyn smiled tightly, pressing her lips together, her mind screaming with the knowledge that she could have purchased the entire bakery with a single signature, yet she let the comment pass, storing it deep inside. The following week brought a venue tour at an exclusive country club that seemed designed to intimidate. The chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors, and the manager spoke of membership requirements as though they were reciting scripture. Edward clapped Evelyn on the shoulder with false warmth, saying, "Don't worry, you're our guest here, so you'll be taken care of." Evelyn felt her blood boil at the implication that she was only present on borrowed privilege, yet she kept her face calm, her eyes steady, and let the moment pass. Alicia beamed, trying to absorb the glamour, clearly torn between pride and discomfort, and Evelyn's heart broke again. She thought of the nights she had stayed up helping Alicia study, the mornings she had gone without so her daughter could have new textbooks, and she wondered how the little girl who once boasted about her mother's strength could now sit so silently as her mother was diminished in front of strangers. The final insult came during another planning session at the Whitmore home when the seating arrangements for the rehearsal dinner were being finalized. Margaret unfolded a large chart across the dining table, her pen tapping against names and numbers, and she looked up at Evelyn with a polished smile. "Now, Evelyn, we'll place you at table 12, near the back. You'll be with some of our more casual guests. We thought you'd be more comfortable there." Evelyn blinked slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, as Alicia fiddled with her phone and David busied himself arranging flowers, both pretending not to hear. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of years of prejudice and humiliation pressing down, and Evelyn could almost hear Richard's voice urging her to stand up and speak. But she swallowed the words, nodding quietly, forcing a polite smile. Margaret beamed, satisfied. "Wonderful. You're so understanding. Not everyone would be so gracious." Edward added, "It can be overwhelming for people who aren't used to this kind of event. We want everyone to feel welcome, of course, but we must also be mindful of our other guests' expectations." Evelyn gripped her hands under the table to stop them from shaking, feeling shame rise in her throat. Not shame of who she was, but shame that her daughter was complicit in this charade. That night, driving home in silence, Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She remembered the pride in Richard's voice every time he told Alicia to never bow her head to anyone, the way he had insisted she carry her black identity with strength and dignity, and she wondered if the girl they had raised had been buried under the weight of the Whitmores' polished arrogance. She thought of her fortune, the secret that sat quietly in the bank, and she knew that sooner or later she would have to bring it to light. But not yet. The Whitmores had shown their true colors, their superiority coded in etiquette, their prejudice disguised as sophistication, and Evelyn wanted the truth to strike when it would cut the deepest. Until then, she would endure, watching carefully, taking mental notes, and waiting for the moment Richard would have wanted her to choose, the moment when silence could no longer protect dignity, and truth would expose the false faces around her. Summary. Evelyn endured increasing slights from the Whitmores as wedding planning continued, including Margaret's pointed remarks about costs, Edward's patronizing reassurances at the country club, and finally being assigned to sit at a back table with casual guests. The words stung, but Alicia's silence hurt even more, and Evelyn, holding her 127, 450, zero secret clothes, vowed to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth and expose their arrogance. Evelyn Johnson returned home from the Whitmore mansion that night carrying more than exhaustion. She carried a heaviness that clung to her bones, the sting of Margaret's voice still echoing in her ears as she assigned Evelyn to table 12 with the casual guests. The quiet agreement of Edward as he spoke about making sure important associates would feel comfortable, and worst of all, the silence of her daughter Alicia, who had chosen to look at her phone instead of raising her voice. And though Evelyn's dignity would not allow her to break in that moment, her heart cracked a little more because she realized the fight was no longer only about enduring the arrogance of the Whitmores, but also about saving Alicia from being swallowed by their polished condescension. When she pulled into her driveway, the modest brick house standing in quiet contrast to the colonial palace she had just left, she sat in her car and stared at the porch light Richard had installed years ago, the glow steady against the night, and she whispered into the darkness, "I see them for who they are, Richard, and I see our daughter for who she is becoming, and I don't know if I can let this go on much longer." Inside, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, unfolding the mental ledger she had been keeping since the day she discovered Richard's secret, the 127, 450, zero that could have rewritten every conversation and shut every sneer, and she thought about how tempting it would be to walk into the Whitmore home with proof of her wealth, to watch their smug politeness collapse into shame, but she held back because she remembered Richard's reasoning for hiding it in the first place. The fear that money would change them, that it would erode their values, that it would make Alicia forget the lessons of perseverance and pride. Evelyn's silence was not weakness, it was strategy, a decision to let the Whitmores reveal themselves fully before she chose her moment, because only then would the truth land with the weight of justice. The following weeks became a blur of wedding preparations, and Evelyn forced herself to attend them all, even when every gathering felt like a battlefield where daggers came wrapped in smiles. There was the dress fitting where Margaret complimented Alicia for her elegance, while glancing at Evelyn's simple attire, murmuring something about how it was wonderful to see how far families could come. There was the florist appointment where Edward casually mentioned that roses symbolized wealth and tradition, looking at Evelyn as if daring her to object. Each time Evelyn nodded, her face calm, her voice polite, and she wrote the moments into her mental ledger. Alicia, meanwhile, grew more and more like a guest star in the Whitmore show, her laughter higher-pitched, her sentences shorter, her eagerness to please almost desperate, and Evelyn's chest tightened each time she saw her daughter dim her own light in order to fit into theirs. Late one night, Evelyn sat with Alicia at the kitchen table after another long day of preparations. Alicia was tired, her eyes rimmed with stress, but when Evelyn tried to ask if she was happy, Alicia brushed it aside. "Mom, I'm fine. I just want everything to go smoothly. David's parents are helping so much, I don't want to disappoint them." Evelyn's stomach twisted at the words. The way Alicia spoke about not wanting to disappoint the Whitmores rather than protecting her own dignity or honoring her father's memory, and Evelyn wanted to shake her, to remind her of who she was, but she only nodded, touching her daughter's hand gently and saying, "Don't forget who you are, Alicia, because the woman your father and I raised was never afraid of standing tall." Alicia smiled faintly, as if the words barely penetrated the fog around her, and Evelyn felt both love and sorrow in equal measure. The rehearsal dinner loomed closer, and Evelyn braced herself for what she knew would be another test. She imagined Margaret's seating chart spread across the table like a battle map, placing Evelyn and her friends in corners, tucking them away where their presence would not disrupt the image the Whitmores wanted to project. She imagined Edward reminding her of the importance of appearances, his tone dripping with paternalistic superiority, and she imagined Alicia sitting quietly, her silence like a wound. Evelyn resolved to endure it, to add it to the ledger, because she knew the more evidence of their arrogance she collected, the more devastating the revelation would be when she finally chose to unleash the truth of her hidden fortune. As she ironed her dress the night before the rehearsal, Evelyn found herself speaking aloud to Richard's photograph on the mantel, her voice low but fierce. "They think they can put me at the back table. They think they can pat me on the head like I'm grateful for their scraps. They think they can turn our daughter into a reflection of their arrogance. But you and I know better. We raised her to be proud, and I will not let them take that away. I'll stay quiet a little longer, but when the time comes, Richard, I will remind them of who we are, and they won't know what hit them." The day of the rehearsal came and, as expected, Evelyn was handed her assignment at table 12 again, the polite explanation delivered with Margaret's most practiced smile. Alicia said nothing, David looked away, and Evelyn felt the familiar sting, but instead of crumbling, she smiled serenely, her silence no longer a wound, but a weapon. She knew the Whitmores thought they had managed her, tucked her neatly into the background, but Evelyn knew the truth. She was the storm waiting just beyond their polished horizon, and when it broke, their carefully constructed facade would shatter. She lifted her glass of water and smiled politely at those around her, but her eyes traveled again and again to Alicia, who sat at the head table glowing with nervous laughter, her smile a mask that did not reach her eyes. And Evelyn wondered how her daughter could sit there and pretend not to see the humiliation her own mother endured. The music played softly, the servers moved gracefully between tables, and Edward gave a toast about tradition, family, and respectability, his voice booming with authority as though he were delivering a speech at a boardroom rather than welcoming his future daughter-in-law's family. Evelyn clapped politely with the rest, but her heart tightened, her patience thinning like glass under strain. The night dragged on with each moment piling onto the weight Evelyn carried. Margaret stopped by her table once, laying a manicured hand on Evelyn's shoulder and thanking her for her graciousness, remarking how not everyone would be so understanding about seating, but that it was better this way, more comfortable for everyone involved. And Evelyn nodded with a small smile while inside her blood boiled, because she could hear the unspoken truth in Margaret's words, that Evelyn and those like her were an inconvenience to be managed, not equals to be honored. When Margaret floated away to laugh with the senator's wife, Evelyn set her glass down firmly, the sound sharp in her ears, and told herself again that silence was still her choice, still her weapon, but she knew the edges of that weapon were sharpening to the point where soon they would cut. Alicia came to her side only briefly, her eyes darting nervously toward David, who remained deep in conversation with his father at the front of the room. Alicia leaned down and whispered, "Mom, thank you for being so patient. It means so much to me." And Evelyn forced a smile though her chest ached. "Baby, patience is not the same as acceptance," she whispered back, and she saw Alicia's face falter, guilt flashing for a brief moment before she smoothed it away and hurried back to her place at David's side. Evelyn watched her daughter walk away and thought of all the lessons Richard had drilled into Alicia's childhood, that she must never bow her head, that her blackness was not a burden but a crown, that dignity could not be purchased or compromised. She thought of the girl who used to brag about her parents' sacrifices, the girl who wrote essays about justice and fairness, and she wondered if that girl had been replaced by a woman willing to trade pride for the approval of the Whitmores. The speeches rolled on, each one more insufferable than the last, with Edward praising his own family's legacy, Margaret talking about charitable works and social responsibility while ignoring the waiters who filled her glass, and even David speaking nervously about blending traditions, his words laced with subtle assurances that he would take care of Alicia as though she were stepping up into his world rather than meeting him as an equal. Evelyn clapped when appropriate, her face unreadable, but inside she began to count each insult as though they were bricks stacking into a wall that would soon collapse under its own weight. She knew she could end it all with a single sentence, a single bank statement pulled from her bag, but she held her ground because the longer she waited, the heavier the revelation would strike. When dessert arrived, Evelyn found herself staring at her plate, untouched, her reflection faint in the silver spoon beside it. She remembered Richard's last words to her, his plea to protect their family's dignity, and she knew that her silence had been about honoring that plea, but tonight something shifted. It was not just about protecting dignity anymore. It was about demanding it, reclaiming it, ensuring that Alicia remembered it before it was too late. Evelyn looked up and locked eyes with her daughter across the room, and in that fleeting second, she thought she saw Alicia's mask slip, saw the flicker of shame, the flash of realization that her mother was suffering while she sat quietly in the glow of borrowed acceptance. Evelyn held her gaze, steady and unflinching, until Alicia looked away, and that was when Evelyn knew the breaking point had come. The night ended with polite applause and practiced smiles, the Whitmores congratulating themselves on another successful display of refinement, and as Evelyn walked to her car, the cool night air filling her lungs, she clenched her fists and whispered into the sky, "Not much longer, Richard, not much longer." She knew the wedding day was close, and with it the moment when her silence would end. The Whitmores had shown her who they were, Alicia had shown her how much she was willing to sacrifice, and Evelyn had seen enough. Her patience had carried her through insults, through dismissals, through being placed at the back like an afterthought, but now her patience had transformed into resolve. She would not let the Whitmores strip away the pride Richard had instilled in their family, and she would not let Alicia forget who she was. The truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would not just expose the arrogance of the Whitmores, it would test whether Alicia could still find the strength to stand with her mother. The Whitmores had arranged everything to dazzle, sparing no expense, and as Evelyn drove to the exclusive country club her daughter Alicia had finally agreed to use as the reception venue, she saw the sprawling lawns, the marble steps, the gilded doors, and she thought of how many lifetimes Richard's hidden fortune of 127,450 could have purchased such a place, how easily she could have outshone the Whitmores with the truth, and yet she held it back because she wanted to see the full measure of their arrogance, because she wanted Alicia to see it too, to feel the sting of what it meant to compromise dignity for the approval of people who would never truly respect her. Inside the ballroom, Evelyn was guided toward the back once more, to a table filled with people who seemed equally unimportant to the Whitmores' social ambitions, and she took her seat quietly, her eyes scanning the glittering chandeliers, the thousands of roses lining the altar, the ice sculptures that gleamed like frozen monuments to wealth, and she reminded herself that no amount of opulence could replace character. She lifted her gaze toward the front where Alicia stood radiant in a gown Evelyn knew had cost more than her car, a gown Margaret had insisted upon, and beside her stood David, polished in his tuxedo, smiling nervously as though every camera flash was a test. Evelyn clapped when the vows were spoken, her face calm, her heart heavy, and she whispered to Richard in her mind that their daughter was beautiful, that she looked like the little girl he used to carry on his shoulders, but also that she looked like she was losing herself, bowing her head where she once stood tall. The ceremony ended in applause, and as the reception began, Evelyn remained at her table, listening to the music and watching as senators, CEOs, and judges toasted with crystal glasses, while her own friends sat uncomfortably in the back, their laughter subdued under the weight of separation. She knew the Whitmores thought this arrangement practical, that they believed they were managing appearances, but to Evelyn, it was nothing more than a reminder that in their eyes, she was a problem to be contained rather than a mother to be honored. When the toast began, Edward spoke first, his booming voice praising tradition and legacy, speaking of how proud he was to see his son continue the Whitmore name, and Evelyn felt each word like a hammer striking the foundation of everything Richard had taught their daughter about identity and pride. Then David spoke, his words awkward, thanking Alicia for her love and his parents for their guidance, and though he said nothing overtly cruel, the way he framed their future together sounded like an invitation for Alicia to join his world rather than an acknowledgement of the world she already carried. Evelyn pressed her lips together, her heart aching. But the speech that cut deepest came from Margaret. She stood with her glass raised, her pearls gleaming, her smile wide, and she began with polished charm. "We are so thrilled to welcome Alicia into our family," she said, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. From the moment David introduced her, we were impressed by her authenticity, her grounded nature, her ability to bring a refreshing perspective to our world. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, the word authenticity hanging in the air like a dagger, because it was not praise but subtle reduction, a way of calling Alicia exotic, different, something to be admired like art, rather than respected as an equal. Margaret continued, speaking about adjustments, about how both families would need to adapt, but when her eyes flicked toward Evelyn's table, her smile sharpened, and she added, "We are confident Alicia will adjust beautifully to our traditions, and we hope that her family will learn to adapt to this new lifestyle as well." The room erupted in polite applause, glasses clinking, smiles beaming, but Evelyn sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap, her jaw tight, her heart pounding with the weight of humiliation. She turned her eyes to Alicia, silently begging her daughter to object, to speak, to rise and defend the dignity of the family that had raised her. But instead, she saw Alicia nodding slightly, her smile weak but present, her silence louder than any insult Margaret could have delivered. That was the breaking point Evelyn had known was coming, the moment where silence was no longer protection but betrayal, where patience had turned into complicity, and she felt a cold calm settle over her. She looked at Richard's photograph in her mind, imagined his eyes meeting hers, and she knew it was time. She rose from her chair, slowly, deliberately, the movement enough to draw glances from the tables around her, and though the music continued faintly, the applause faded as people realized something was happening. She stepped forward, her shawl draped across her shoulders, her posture regal, her eyes steady, and she felt the weight of every gaze in the room fall upon her. Margaret faltered in her speech for the first time, her smile slipping before snapping back into place. "Of course, Evelyn. Would you like to say a few words?" she said, her voice laced with the sweetness of someone indulging a child. Evelyn inclined her head, took the microphone, and stood tall at the front of the room. Her voice carried with the strength of decades spent demanding dignity in a world that often denied it. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her tone calm, her words deliberate. "It means the world to see Alicia and David surrounded by so many faces tonight." She paused, letting the silence stretch, the anticipation grow. "I've been thinking a lot about respect, about what it means to treat people with dignity regardless of what they look like or what they own. And tonight, I want to make something clear." She reached into her handbag, pulling out a folded sheet of paper, the very bank statement she had carried since discovering Richard's secret, and she held it up for the front rows to see. "My late husband left me something before he died, something he kept hidden for 30 years, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted our family to live with pride rather than privilege. He left me $127,450,000. Evelyn did not tremble or fidget as she stood at the microphone. Instead, she folded her paper neatly and slipped it back into her handbag with the same deliberate grace her mother once used when folding church programs. Then she let her gaze sweep across the room, pausing on each pair of eyes that had dismissed her earlier, and she spoke again with steady conviction. "Respect is not measured by the size of your bank account, nor by the title you carry, nor by the number of chandeliers hanging over your table," she said, her voice slicing through the air. "Respect is measured by how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. Tonight, you all showed me exactly how much or how little respect you have." The room erupted in murmurs, some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others staring at Margaret and Edward to see how they would respond, and Evelyn took one more deliberate step forward, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulder as she raised her chin. "I spent my life working in hospital facilities, keeping systems running so doctors could save lives, and I did it with pride. I raised a daughter who became a physician, a woman who should be proud of where she came from. And I was married to a man who believed dignity mattered more than money. But tonight, while you toasted your traditions and your power, you tucked me in the back like an embarrassment. You treated my presence as something to be managed. You believed my silence meant acceptance. But let me tell you something. Silence is not the same as acceptance. Silence is patience, and patience runs out." Her words echoed against the polished walls, and the waitstaff froze in place, holding trays mid-air, as though even they understood the gravity of the moment. Edward finally found his voice, rising halfway from his seat, his face flushed. "Mrs. Johnson, we had no idea," he stammered, but Evelyn cut him off with a raised hand, the same hand she had once used to quiet Alicia when she was a child. "That's exactly the point," Evelyn said. "You didn't know, so you assumed. You assumed you were above me. You assumed I was less. You assumed I should be hidden in the shadows of your wealth. And my daughter sat quietly while you did it." Her voice softened at the end, turning toward Alicia, who sat pale and trembling at the head table, tears streaming down her cheeks as she finally looked at her mother, not with embarrassment, but with anguish. "Mom," Alicia whispered, her voice breaking, but Evelyn pressed on, because she knew this was not just about humiliating the Whitmores, it was about reclaiming her daughter's dignity before it slipped completely away. "Alicia," she said, her voice steady, "I love you more than life itself, but I raised you better than this. Your father and I taught you that character matters more than wealth, that you should never be ashamed of where you come from, and yet tonight you bowed your head while they treated me like I was nothing. That's not the woman we raised." Alicia covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking, and the crowd looked on with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, because they could no longer pretend this was merely a wedding toast. It had become a reckoning. Victoria's maid of honor, an old friend from Georgetown, shifted awkwardly, and even David seemed paralyzed, his polished exterior cracked, his hand twitching as if he wanted to stand but not knowing what to say. Evelyn took one more breath, letting the silence deepen, then spoke again. "So here is what's going to happen. I am leaving this reception because I will not sit in a room where my presence is treated as a burden. I will go back to my home, the same home where I raised my daughter, where I loved my husband, where I built a life of dignity without needing chandeliers and marble floors. And I will wait for the day my daughter remembers who she is. If she cannot remember, then at least I will know I stayed true to myself." She set the microphone back on its stand with finality, the thud reverberating in the room, and she turned toward the doors, her shawl trailing behind her like a banner of quiet defiance. Gasps and whispers followed her as she walked down the aisle between the tables, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and though some guests avoided her eyes, others stared with something that looked like admiration, as if they had just witnessed a truth too rare in their world of polished lies. Margaret's face was a mask of stone, Edward's lips pressed into a thin line, and David sat frozen beside Alicia, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between his fiancée and her mother. Evelyn did not look back, not until she had pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the cool night air, the sounds of the ballroom muffled behind her. She inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs, and for the first time in months she felt light, unburdened, her silence lifted, her dignity intact. She had reached her car when she heard the hurried footsteps, the scuff of shoes on pavement, and then the sound of her daughter's voice, raw and desperate. "Mom, wait!" Alicia cried, rushing across the parking lot in her wedding gown, her veil askew, her eyes wet with tears. Evelyn stopped but did not turn immediately, letting her daughter come closer before she finally faced her. Alicia's mascara streaked her cheeks, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress as though she needed to hold something solid. "Mom, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I don't know what happened to me. I let them get in my head, I let them make me ashamed, and I should have defended you. I should have stood up. Please, don't leave like this." Evelyn's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "You got seduced by their world," she said. "You started believing their wealth made them better, and you forgot who you are. You forgot who raised you." Alicia shook her head fiercely, tears spilling. "You're right, I lost myself, but I see it now. I saw it in your eyes tonight. I don't want to be that woman, Mom. I want to be the daughter you raised, the woman Dad would be proud of. Please give me a chance to make it right." Evelyn stepped closer, placing a hand on her daughter's cheek, brushing away the tears. "You'll have to prove it, Alicia," she said softly. "Words are not enough. You'll have to show me that you remember your worth, that you choose dignity over convenience, that you stand up even when it's hard." Alicia nodded, her sobs quieting, her eyes blazing with the determination Evelyn had prayed to see. Behind them, the ballroom buzzed with gossip, the Whitmores struggling to regain their composure, but in the parking lot Evelyn and Alicia stood in a circle of honesty the chandeliers could never create. Evelyn pulled her daughter into her arms, hugging her tightly, feeling the same fragile but fierce love she had felt when holding her as a baby, and she whispered, "I love you, Alicia. Nothing will ever change that. But never again let anyone make you ashamed of me or of yourself." Alicia clung to her, nodding into her shoulder, and for the first time since Richard's death, Evelyn felt the possibility of hope, fragile but real, blooming in the night. Evelyn Johnson stood in the parking lot holding her daughter Alicia in her arms, the echoes of the ballroom's polite applause and whispered gossip still faintly audible behind the heavy doors. But here in the night air, under the quiet glow of the street lamps, the noise of wealth and pretense seemed far away, and what remained was the bond between a black mother who had carried her family through storms and a daughter who was finally remembering where she came from. Evelyn smoothed Alicia's veil with steady hands, her heart both heavy and hopeful, and she whispered that love would always bind them, but dignity must guide them, and Alicia nodded fiercely, tears still streaming, but her eyes alight with the recognition that she had strayed and the determination to find her way back. David had not followed, nor had his parents, and Evelyn did not care, because this moment was not for them, it was for the legacy Richard had left, and the woman Alicia was still capable of becoming. They sat together in Evelyn's car for a long time, the dashboard lights dimly illuminating Alicia's pale face as she confessed how easily she had been swept up in the Whitmores' world, how she had silenced herself because she wanted to fit in, how she thought blending into their traditions meant proving herself worthy, and Evelyn listened patiently, her heart aching but steady, then said, Baby, you never needed to prove yourself to them. Your worth was never theirs to measure. Your father and I taught you that worth comes from character, not approval, from how you treat others, not how others look at you. And tonight, you forgot, but the good news is, you remembered in time. Alicia gripped her mother's hand tightly, nodding, promising she would do better, that she would stand taller, that she would not let herself be diminished again. And Evelyn felt Richard's presence as if he were sitting in the back seat, nodding in agreement. Evelyn reached into her handbag and pulled out a different envelope this time, not the bank statement she had revealed to the world, but a letter in Richard's handwriting, worn at the edges from her having read it so many times since his passing, and she placed it in Alicia's lap. Your father left me this too, Evelyn said. Not just money, but instructions. He wanted the wealth to mean something beyond us, something that would honor the values he lived by. He wanted us to create the Johnson Foundation, a place that would provide scholarships for kids from working-class families, kids who are smart and hardworking but lack the resources to chase their dreams. He wanted them to become doctors, teachers, engineers, the very people who build communities. That was his vision. And one day, he wanted you to help lead it. Alicia unfolded the letter with trembling hands, her eyes scanning Richard's familiar handwriting, and her lips parted in awe as she read his words about equality, opportunity, and dignity. Tears spilled anew, but this time, they were not of shame, but of gratitude, because she understood that her father had trusted her with something greater than herself. Mom, Alicia whispered, this is what I should be proud of. This is what I should have carried into that room instead of trying to imitate them. Evelyn nodded, squeezing her hand. Yes, baby. Money does not make you better, but what you do with it can make the world better. That's what your father believed, and that's what I will carry forward. And if you are ready, that is what you will help me carry too. Alicia nodded fiercely, determination burning through her tears, and Evelyn saw in her daughter's face the strength she feared had been lost. The strength Richard had always known was there. When they returned to the ballroom, Alicia walked ahead of her mother, her veil slightly disheveled, but her back straighter than it had been all evening, and she asked for the microphone. The room stilled again, the Whitmores stiffening at the sight of her, but Alicia spoke with a voice steady and clear. I need to say something, she began, glancing at her mother and drawing strength from Evelyn's calm gaze. Tonight I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I let my mother be treated as less, and that was wrong. My mother is the reason I am who I am, the reason I stand here as a doctor, the reason I know what hard work and dignity mean. She deserves respect, not condescension. And if I have to choose between blending into someone else's world and standing proudly in hers, I will choose her every time. The crowd murmured, some impressed, others uncomfortable, but Evelyn felt a swell of pride so strong she nearly wept. Because in that moment, Alicia was no longer the nervous bride trying to appease the Whitmores, but the daughter she and Richard had raised, the woman who would carry their legacy. David rose awkwardly, caught between his parents' withering stares and Alicia's fierce declaration, and for the first time he looked uncertain, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Margaret's smile cracked, Edward's jaw tightened, but Evelyn no longer cared for their reactions. She and Alicia had reclaimed the narrative, and no amount of wealth or status could erase that. The rest of the reception passed in uneasy politeness, but Evelyn had already decided she would not linger. When it was time to leave, she kissed her daughter's forehead, whispered that she was proud, and drove home with a heart lighter than it had been in months. Back at her house, the modest home that had held decades of laughter, tears, and memories, Evelyn sat in her recliner and exhaled deeply, the silence finally comforting rather than suffocating. She thought of Richard's fortune, still vast and untouched in accounts waiting to fund futures, and she thought of the letter Alicia now carried, a torch passed from father to daughter. She knew challenges lay ahead, that the Whitmores would resist, that the world would not suddenly become just, but she also knew she had planted something powerful that night, the reminder that dignity cannot be bought, that respect must be earned, and that legacy is measured not by chandeliers and marble floors, but by lives uplifted and futures opened. The end. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. I'd love for you to support this channel by hitting the like button and subscribing so you don't miss more stories like this one. It really helps us keep creating. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think of this plot? Did Evelyn make the right choice by keeping her secret until the wedding? And how do you feel about Alicia finally standing up for her mother? Share your thoughts in the comments. And while you're there, let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing the different places around the world where people are tuning in.